For our next speaker here, which is Dr. Marisa Erasmus.
Okay. All right, good morning, everybody. I'm Marisa Erasmus. I'm an associate professor at Purdue University. My lab focuses mainly on things with feathers, so chickens, ducks, turkeys, but I do occasionally get roped into studying other species as well. For the past couple of years, we've been looking into walking ability, so assessing gait scores, mainly with turkeys, but also been doing a little bit of work with broiler chickens as well. And so today I will give you just a couple examples of some of the work that we've been doing and kind of leading into a little bit of the sustainability impacts and so on. So when we're thinking about walking ability, it's really important for a number of different reasons, right? And so lameness, leg health issues are some of the major welfare issues for our meat poultry, and walking ability is crucial for their behavior. So earlier today, Dr. Anderson presented kind of the 5 domains model. So if we're thinking about that behavioral aspect, right, being able to walk places, interact with conspecifics, or potentially avoid interactions, interact with humans. In terms of that behavior space, walking ability is crucial. Reaching resources to help maintain body condition, right? Consuming all that feed so that we can convert that into products for human use. Walking ability is also really important from an animal welfare standpoint in terms of skeletal health. So animals that are more active tend to have stronger bones, and that helps them to be more resilient in terms of developing lameness issues later on. And then we also use gait score as part of our welfare assessment toolbox. And so I'll talk a little bit later about some of the gait scoring that we use, but it's one of the major things that we have that we can use to actually evaluate some aspects of poultry welfare. And then lastly, walking ability relates to product quality as well. So animals that are not able to walk as well are more prone to getting scratches. They're more likely to develop foot pad dermatitis, which is inflammation of the foot pads, hawkburn, inflammation of the hocks, and this can be an entry point for bacteria, which could have potential food safety implications as well. Let me just get oriented here. So in terms of our turkeys, what we know is that over 40% of turkeys, based on a relatively recent study, do develop some walking ability issues by the time that they reach market weight. And then there was a recent survey of Canadian turkey producers, and over 90% of them cited leg health issues as the main reason for culling those birds. And then leg problems are associated with carcass condemnations at the slaughter plant as well. What we know for broiler chickens, it varies in terms of the percentage of birds that do develop gait issues. Over 19%, according to another somewhat recent study, do develop gait problems that are severe enough to actually impair their locomotion. And this is around 28 to 30 days of age. And then these gait impediments are associated with other issues like hawkburn and foot pad dermatitis as well. So there's the Turkey Health Task Force that's run through the National Turkey Federation, and they put out a really nice report every year. And leg problems have been cited as among the top 10 health issues for turkeys for the past several years. And this, one of the reasons is because leg problems also contribute to late mortality. So that's mortality in excess of 1.5% when turkeys reach 17 weeks of age or older. So they're usually marketed between 18 to 20 weeks of age. And so by 17 weeks, if you're seeing mortality over 1.5%, a lot of that is due to leg health issues. So it's a major economic impact to the industry and something that we've kind of been looking into, but it's multifactorial, right? So it's kind of hard to pinpoint causes for leg health. There could be infectious causes and non-infectious causes. We've mainly been looking into some of the non-infectious causes, and there's a whole bunch of them. So genetics being one of them, and that goes along with body weight and age. So as animals get older, they tend to develop leg issues. As they get heavier, you can't really separate body weight from age very well. Litter quality is another one. So wet litter is going to predispose those birds to developing foot pad dermatitis and hawkburn. those can then lead to leg health issues as well. I mentioned exercise and activity level earlier. And so again, animals that are more active, they tend to be a little more resilient to developing leg health issues. But then of course, once they develop those issues, activity levels are going to drop. Lighting and photo period is something that's also been identified as having an impact on leg health. Bone mineral density, this is one that we don't have a ton of information on yet, but there's some evidence that calcium turnover in the bones and phosphorus and potassium as well could influence leg health issues, and that goes along with nutrition, so what those birds are being fed. And so some of the things that I'll focus on today, the three main ones are stocking density, and that goes along with age, and then environmental enrichment as well. So I have to thank Dr. Daigle for that fabulous introduction to environmental enrichment, because now you all kind of know what it is, and hopefully I don't have to talk too much about that part. But in terms of stocking density, this is one where there is quite a bit of literature on it for broiler chickens. But one of the issues is it's really hard to separate the effects of stocking density per se with all of the other things that come along with it. So as birds get older, they get heavier, they take up more space, so their stocking density increases. As birds get older, as we put more birds in the same space, we're going to start seeing issues with litter quality and air quality. And so that's going to lead to issues with footpad dermatitis and hawkburn, some of those other things that we measure as part of welfare assessments. And typically we do see a lot of studies will compare different densities, and generally the higher density will be associated with worse footpad dermatitis, worse hawkburn scores, more leg health issues, reduced activity levels. And part of that could just be because there's less space for birds to move around. They have to move around and over each other if they want to get somewhere. So there may be more disturbances of birds as well. There's some papers showing that resting behavior is more disturbed when we stock birds at higher densities, just because there's more of them in that space. So it's really hard to pinpoint what is the perfect stocking density. So that doesn't really exist. We just know, generally speaking, because of all these other things that are confounded with stocking density, we tend to see deteriorations in some welfare metrics. Okay. But then again, management is also key, right? So a lot of changes that happen in bird welfare also come down to how those birds are being managed. So I'm going to just present a really quick overview of a study we did with some broiler chickens on 4 commercial farms in Indiana. And so these were actually curtain-sided barns, so they had some natural light coming in. And this was part of a larger study where we were looking to try and identify ways of identifying changes in gait score of broilers over time. So for this study, we actually constructed temporary fences within the barn. And so we divided it into 4 groups, and we had one group that was at the farm stocking density, which on this farm was 6 pounds per square foot. And all the birds, let me just see, these had what we would consider good gait scores. So we went in, birds were 33 days of age. We randomly selected birds within that entire barn. And one of the reasons we chose to do this on a commercial facility is so that we could get that variation in gait score that we wouldn't necessarily see in really small pens. So we scored them for gait and separated them into groups that had good gait and groups that had affected or impaired gait. And so we took our good gait birds, put them in one pen. We took our affected gait birds, put them in another pen. Both of these were at the farm stocking density, so similar to the other birds within the rest of the barn. We took good gait and poor gait birds, half of each, mixed them together at the farm stocking density, and then took another group of half good gait, half poorer gait, mixed them together, and then housed them at half of what that farm stocking density was. And again, this was so that we could track on video to see kind of how those changes in gait occur over time. Unfortunately, I don't have that data to present to you, but what I can show you is how gait changed with just within a span of just 4 days. So we did this at 33 days of age, went back at 37 days of age, and scored all of these birds again. And this is the gait score that we use. It's called the Bristol scale, and it's the one that's used as part of the welfare quality assessment protocol as well. And so it ranges from 0 to 5, with 5 being complete lameness. We scored birds. Mainly we had scores ranging from 0 to 3, a few 4s. It being a commercial barn, anything that's a 5 should be culled because they can't move. So we had our group of what we consider sound birds were scores of 0 and 1. And then we had mainly scores of 2 and 3, mostly 2s for our affected birds. And so the results that I'll be presenting are odds ratios for the statistical analysis. So that is where it's giving us the odds of a bird having a perfect score. So if I'm comparing 2 groups, it'll say one group has higher odds of having a perfect gait compared to the other group. And so this one, first, we're looking at changes over time for each group here. So at 33 days of age, in all of our groups, we saw a decline in walking ability over time. In our group where we had both the poor and the good gait in the same group, but housed at the low density, we saw that 37% of those birds switched from having a good gait to a worse gait score. So 37% change. We also saw a 20% change in their foot pad scores, going from good to a little slightly worse. And then the odds of having good foot pads were higher at 33 days than 37 days, which is what we would expect. Similarly, for hawkburn, the incidence of hawkburn increased over time. And we saw that in 44% of our birds, when they're housed at the lower density, they had hawkburn that was worse than when we started out 4 days before that. Similarly, for our birds housed in a mixed group, but at the farm density, we saw that 49% of them changed gait scores. And again, foot pad dermatitis and hawkburn was more prevalent at 37 days of age than at 33 days of age, which is consistent for the other 2 groups as well. For our affected birds, those that started off with a score of 2 or 3, we had 17% of them that switched. So this is actually lower. We didn't do statistical analysis on that, but numerically lower, right, than the other groups. And then for our sound birds, we actually had 78% of birds. So that's quite a lot, right? Changing from a score of 0, 1 to 2 and higher. Okay, so a lot of the other literature that's published will give like an average score for the whole group. But here we were really interested in looking at within this group, if we can separate them in terms of what they start out with at 33 days of age, which is when they're getting closer to market weight and we're starting to see changes in gait score happening. What happens if we make some changes in their environment and if we house them in a group where birds have either all the same gait or mixed gait? So we're seeing 78% of our sound birds switching over to something that's trying to not switch high and low, worse walking ability. But again, these birds, we're not talking about scores of 4 and 5 here, right? So it's switching to like a 2 or a 3. Mainly we're seeing switching to 2. In terms of comparing the groups, so at 33 days of age, we selected them to be different, right? So our sound group was different from our affected group. Our 2 mixed groups were not. At 37 days of age, we found that when we're comparing the mixed groups to each other in terms of the low density and high density, that the low density birds were more likely to have a good gait score compared to the higher density, which would be the farm density. And again, this farm density is actually lower than commercial practice. And the reason for that is because they follow the Global Animal Partnership Animal Welfare Certification Guidelines. So they're GAP Step 2 certified. So their density is already lower than what a lot of commercial practice is. And when we compare our affected birds to our mixed group with low density, we're seeing that the affected birds actually have a lower odds of having a good gait compared to our mixed low density birds. Similarly for foot pad scores, our affected, so those that started out with a poor gait, have lower odds of having good or better scores for foot pad dermatitis compared to the mixed birds. And then when we compare our sound birds, so those that started out with better gait scores, to a mixed group at a lower density, we're actually finding no difference in the odds of having gait scores that are better. So the sound birds at the farm stocking density did not differ from the mixed birds at the low density in terms of gait. For foot pads, our sound birds were actually faring worse than those mixed gait birds at the lower density. And for hawks, we found no difference there. For comparing our sound birds to the mixed birds at the farm density, so they would be at the same stocking density, one group starting out with all good gait, one group starting out with half of them having a worse gait score. We found that there was a difference in gait score. So the sound birds did still have, by 37 days of age, better odds of having good gait compared to those mixed birds if they're housed at the same density. And then in terms of comparing the sound birds to the affected birds at 37 days of age, again, this is within a 4-day period of time, we're seeing that the sound birds still have, better gait than the affected, which would be expected. And they also have better hocks, but foot pads, not so much. So we do see there are some interesting things here in terms of the interactions between stocking density and gait scores. We're not at a point, unfortunately, where we can separate, stocking density from age, body weight, and so on. But this at least gives us some indication. So one of the reasons we decided to do this at 33 days of age is some practices or some places in Europe practice thinning. So where they'll go in and take birds out of the flocks, and that'll create more space. And so we're trying to look at kind of this interaction between space availability and gait. Because one of the other issues with gait is when we go in to do peer tests, which are part of welfare assessments, if those birds are not moving away from us, is it because they have poor gait and they physically can't? Or is it because they truly are not fearful of humans? And we're using that fear test a lot in terms of welfare. And so those are some of the other things that we've been trying to disentangle here. And this is with a collaborator in Denmark, Dr. Anja Reiber. So she's been doing quite a bit of that research. And so when we're comparing low density and high density birds, similar to a lot of the other literature that we found, we do see a decrease in walking ability, foot pad dermatitis, and hawkburn. And so there is this age-related effect here that we're seeing, and also tying in with stocking density. But again, right, it's hard to disentangle stocking density from some of those other factors that I mentioned earlier. And so I do need to give credit to my PhD student, Haley Yoder. She spent many hours going onto those farms, putting up cameras, and just like the other speakers mentioned, we have a small army of undergrads that are always watching video. And so we're still continuing on with some of this analysis, and there's still a lot more work to be done kind of in the broiler gait space. So I'm going to switch over to turkeys because we've done quite a bit more work with turkeys. And so one of the earlier studies that we did with my grad student, Rachel Stevenson, was actually looking at, can we measure aspects of turkey gait and look at how those quantitative measures change over time as these birds get older. And so we used this pressure sensing walkway, and we had to habituate the birds to walk on that, and it will give you a readout of their footprints and give you all kinds of metrics and things that you can measure. We also put accelerometers on them. So that's the device up on the left-hand side there. It's about the size of a piece of gum, and it's kind of like a Fitbit for turkeys. And so we're using all of this different technologies to kind of validate using the accelerometers. And I will say that the farm staff were not super excited with us because these turkeys were so used to coming out of their pens and walking on that mat that when somebody would open the door, the turkeys would think it was just time to come out. So I guess we did a really good job habituating them. I don't know. But we assessed them at 12 weeks of age and 16 weeks of age. So we only went up to 16 weeks and found some interesting results in terms of when you compare those two time points. We also looked at 8 weeks, and usually we don't see a lot of gait issues at 8 weeks, right? We start seeing them later on. And so as they get older, they're spending less time standing or spending more time standing on both feet. They're taking fewer steps, and they exert more pressure, which makes sense, right? They're heavier, but you can see this reflected in the graph. And the other thing that is interesting is when you compare 12 weeks to 16 weeks, they actually had a higher force of pressure here at 12 weeks than 16 weeks. So we are seeing some things peaking at 12 weeks and then dropping down when they get to 16 weeks of age. So step length is also longer at 12 weeks. Step velocity, so how fast they're moving, is faster at 12 weeks. They're taking longer strides at 12 weeks. So between 12 and 16 weeks, we're seeing quite a lot of changes happening in terms of their gait and how they're walking. So that led us to do some more work, but mainly focusing on environmental enrichment. So we know we're seeing these changes between 12 and 16 weeks. What does it mean, right? What are all the different factors leading up to that? Certainly, growth is part of it. We're seeing a lot of changes in terms of their morphology. So they've been selected to put on, a ton of breast muscle that's changing their stability potentially, how they're walking. And so one of the things that we've been working on in the past few years is to look at environmental enrichment and whether that can lead to improvements in walking ability. There's some literature from broiler chickens showing that different types of enrichments can increase activity levels, which can have a protective effect in terms of gait later on. With environmental enrichment, though, we do need to be cautious about what we're trying to use it for. So Dr. Daigle mentioned it needs to be something that's biologically relevant, right? So what are we trying to do with that? Are we trying to get the animals to perform certain behaviors like foraging? Are we trying to prevent them from doing negative behaviors like injurious pecking, where they're pecking at each other? Are we potentially trying to improve leg health? So what are the different types of enrichments that can be used? How are they used? There's still quite a lot of questions. So I mentioned that the broiler farm that we worked at is part of Global Animal Partnership Certification Program. So for those broilers, they have different kinds of enrichments that they use. We used some of the similar enrichments and tested those in turkeys because there's not a ton of research for turkeys, even though these three certification programs, so American Humane, Global Animal Partnership, and Certified Humane, they do have standards for enrichment for turkeys, but it varies. So one of them states that you don't need to provide any enrichment for the first 10 days if you're following their program. Another one would like you to implement it, at around 7 weeks of age, if I remember correctly. And then another one says, well, at 10 weeks of age is when you can start implementing enrichment if you want to be part of that program. So it really varies a lot. They also vary in terms of the types of enrichments that they suggest people use. Straw bales are pretty consistent across the board, but things like perches, when turkeys get to be 10, 12 weeks of age, they're not going to be using perches, right? So for younger ages, they may work, but again, there's not a lot of research on this. We don't really know if they want to perch or they just physically can't or don't want to. So there's still a lot of variability. So we used some of the enrichments that they suggest in these programs as a guide to kind of come up with our experimental design. And so I do need to credit my PhD student, Yiru, who's done all of this work, collected all of the data. And we had 5 enriched groups and then a control group that had no enrichment. So we built these platforms in the upper left corner. Birds could access it via ramps on 2 sides, and then they could rest on this platform. They could also go underneath it. We had another group that had both a platform and a straw bale that they could use. We had a group that only had a straw bale. And then, so some of the broiler facilities, and I know Dr. Christensen uses this as well, are these huts that they use for broilers. So we were trying something similar for turkeys. In our case, we call it a turkey tunnel because it starts with a T. And so we made kind of a rounded tunnel with the idea being that as they get older, hopefully they could still fit under there. So it was a little bit of trial and error. We'll say that when they get to 8, 9 weeks of age, they do like to try and perch on top of those. So we had some reinforcing that we had to do because things would collapse. Lots of learning that happened during this project. And then we also had pecking blocks, and these were donated by Cargill. They were interested in seeing if these pecking blocks would be effective. And so I know there are some producers that are using pecking blocks in their barns. There are different pecking blocks available. There's different kinds of things you could put in those blocks for the birds to peck at. So we tested those as well. And then again, we had our sixth group where they just didn't have any additional enrichment in their pens. And we had 16 to 17 birds in a pen, right? So it's nowhere close to what you would see on a commercial scale, but it's at least a start for us to kind of look at how these enrichments might be influencing the birds. So these are also odds ratios again. So what this is showing is when we're comparing age here for our group. So at 8 weeks compared to 19 weeks, birds that had that platform had a higher odds of having a good gait compared to 19 weeks. So in most of our groups, so the platform group, the group that had a platform and a straw bale, our pecking block group, and I'm trying to think of what the other one was, just the straw bale group. In those 4 groups, pretty consistently, at 19 weeks of age, gait scores worse than at 8 weeks and 12 weeks. Okay. When we get to our tunnel group and our control group that has no enrichment, we're starting to see differences at 16 weeks of age, where the gait score at 16 weeks is worse. So they're having lower walking ability starting at 16 weeks compared to 8 weeks and 12 weeks. So it looks like there may be an earlier onset of gait issues with these 2 groups. But within each age, we did not see a difference, right, in the overall gait when we're comparing our enriched groups. So that was kind of interesting. So we'll need to do some more digging there to see what's going on. We also looked at their behavior and how they're using these enrichments. And as you would expect over time, their use of these enrichments goes down, right? So by 16 weeks of age, we're seeing that about 15% of the birds are using the enrichment at any one time, compared to almost 20%, it's about 18% here at 8 weeks of age. So overall, right, we're seeing that, you know, birds are using it, but it goes down over time. When we compare our groups, there are large differences in terms of which enrichments the majority of the birds are using at any one time. So the pecking block is the lowest. You can see that not even 10% of our birds are using that. So we did scan sampling. So every 15 minutes, we counted the number of birds using each enrichment, converted that to a percentage or a proportion, and did that starting from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. at each age. So we have kind of a nice, a full day capturing of when these birds are using these enrichments. The platform and bale treatment, which is the one that we had kind of the combination there, more things for them to do with those enrichments. So not really that surprising that more birds are using those enrichments compared to all the other groups. So we have our platform and bale group having the highest use, followed by the platform, the straw bale, and then the tunnel and block were not really different. So the rationale for that tunnel is because turkeys do develop injurious pecking behavior where they will perform feather pecking, potentially cannibalism. They can also be quite aggressive. So these are toms. We didn't see a lot of aggression in this flock, thankfully, but they could potentially use that tunnel to try and escape from birds that are being aggressive or that want to perform some of that injurious behavior. So there is some usage, but again, highest in the platform and straw bale treatment group there. We also looked at wing feather quality, foot pad scores, and we found that wing feather quality was actually better with the tunnel and the straw bale, a little bit better than in the other groups. And then again, we did see that the gait scores, we started to see significant differences for the tunnel group and the control group starting at 16 weeks of age. So it may be that providing kind of a multifunctional enrichment, more things for them to do is beneficial in terms of gait. Don't have full answers on that one yet. We also saw within the straw group that those birds had better foot pad scores compared to the other groups. So it may be, and at least in our case, we did have some days where we had wet litter. So that straw may be providing a barrier for the moisture to go down into the wood shavings. actually having a kind of a beneficial effect in terms of foot pad scores. I will mention that I also worked with Dr. Stacy Zelli, who's a meat scientist in our department, looking at meat quality differences for these treatment groups. And I think the main difference, and I can look this up later because I don't have my notes in front of me, but one of the main differences was just in terms of color. So I think there was some differences in the lightness of the meat between the groups, but we didn't see any differences in drip loss or percentage of meat from different areas. So, because we had a question in terms of muscle development, right? So if you're giving birds a platform and if they're using that, is that potentially going to change the muscle fibers or just development of the muscle because those birds are just more active? We're still looking to analyze the accelerometer data to look at activity levels on these birds. So there's still quite a lot more pieces to this puzzle that we need to look into. So we're doing follow-up work. Actually, we use that as preliminary data to get a USDA grant, and we have a lot more things that we're going to be looking at. I'm working with Dr. Luis Brito, who's a geneticist, and my grad student Nathan, who's been doing a ton of the data collection. And our two objectives are first to look at enrichments again in terms of walking ability and behavior. We're also adding in that pressure sensing walking pad that I mentioned earlier to look at some of those quantitative measures of gait. And then secondly, we're looking at the genomics aspects and also bone density and bone quality. So Dr. Prafula Regmi at the University of Georgia is doing bone breaking strengths. So we're sending him leg bones, tibia and femurs to see, if we have these different enrichments, will we be seeing some differences in bone breaking strength as well? And then he's also looking into bone mineral density. So looking at calcium absorption and turnover rates in the blood of these birds. And then I need to add that we have added another treatment. So instead of the combined platform and straw bale group, we are trying out little robots. There's some, companies that are creating these robots for people to use in poultry barns. And so we had these little robots and they have lights attached to them and they zoom around, and some of the birds will actually follow them and scratch around where the light is shining. Did have some issues with robots breaking down. And so my troubleshooting led me to the grocery store / toy store where I bought a Batman all-terrain vehicle. So my students were zipping the Batman vehicle around because we just couldn't get those robots to work very well. And the point is to get the birds up and moving, right? So we're trying to see if just that increased activity is going to be enough to potentially give us some changes in gait. Don't have the data analyzed yet, but that's something that we're hoping to have soon. So I'm talking a lot about enrichment, but at the end of the day, we can design the most fabulous enrichment ever, and it may never get implemented in a barn because it's not practical, right? So there are a number of different considerations related to enrichment. One of them being, as I mentioned, the goal. Is the goal to get birds to peck at something? Is it to get them up and moving? Is it to get them to forage more? Is it all of the above? That's going to change what type of enrichment we're using. The age, we still don't have a good answer for when is it best to implement this enrichment. Enrichments cost money. Ideally, we'd like to implement it, early on when they're young. But as I showed, they either lose interest over time, get used to it, or they get older, slower, don't want to move as much. So it really is a program, right? It's a lot of the literature that we have on enrichment is from what Dr. Daigle mentioned, the zoo field, where enrichment is kind of their thing that they have to do every day with these captive wild animals that are on display. So the big challenge there is to try and create enrichments that are engaging, that keep those animals occupied on a daily basis. In a poultry barn, we're not going to have someone going in there every single day switching out enrichments because it's probably too expensive and just not feasible in terms of from a labor standpoint and how much time it takes. We also don't fully understand how many enrichments do we need for the number of animals in the barn. We don't want to create a situation where the dominant animals are commandeering the enrichment and other animals can't benefit from them, or a situation where animals are fighting over that resource and now we've created a secondary issue. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions. And then sometimes producers will just put things in that work for them and they may see an impact, right? Every flock is different in terms of developing injurious pecking behavior too. So there may be some things that people are trying out there that on the research side, we don't have published information. So I'm always open to hearing kind of people's experiences. The other thing, I was talking to some veterinarians last week, and these straw bales, they're great in terms of birds being able to pick them apart, but they pick them apart really fast. And so we had a situation where every 1 to 2 weeks, once those birds hit 14, 15 weeks of age, we would need to go in, scrape the straw, bring in a new straw bale. I think my student ran to Rural King and like bought out all of the straw bales the 1 week. And so again, from a practicality standpoint, it's good to know what we can do, but it's not necessarily feasible. You can see they like to sit on it. Birds poop a lot, so it becomes soiled, and then you have other birds pecking at those soiled straw pieces. So that's something else to consider as well. So in terms of where we're at, we're looking at some pieces of the puzzle when it comes to leg health and walking ability. So walking ability, as I mentioned, is crucially important from an animal welfare standpoint for our meat birds, but there are a lot of different factors that interact here. So we know on the management side that, nutrition can impact it, lighting, photo period, litter management. We know from an environmental standpoint that, air quality and whatever infectious things are in that environment can influence it. We still need more information on the bird part. So bird characteristics in terms of genomics. We do know that, the genetics companies are selecting for longevity and walking ability. They have their gait scores that they're using, but there's still a lot more data there in terms of bone mineral density, individual birds developing certain, even just deformities, right? There's a lot more data that we need to collect there. So that's what we're kind of hoping to do in the next few years, is just take more of a holistic overview and apply some of that to look at lameness. We're also going to be working with some commercial farms because, as I mentioned, in our small pens that we have at Purdue, it's not representative of what you see on a large commercial scale. We don't have the variability in gait or the ability to really figure out why birds on a commercial scale might be culled, right? Is it because of infectious leg issues, or are there some other things going on? So we're going to be working with some commercial facilities as well to hopefully provide some more information to this. So I do need to thank all of the people that have been helping with all of these different projects, funding agencies, commercial farms that have donated their time, their birds. All of the undergraduate students that are still watching video, eating popcorn maybe while they're doing their turkey TV, I don't know. And then of course my collaborators as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
So in your enrichments in poultry facilities, did you do anything with color?
I have not personally, but that is a really good point and something that I've been thinking about. When I was doing my PhD at Michigan State, I did like a really small experiment with some turkey poults, and I had a square of paper with a bunch of colored dots on there to see what colors they prefer on day one, which again may be different from what they prefer later on, but they really went for green, like the majority of them. And I know there's some papers where they've used like green LED lights to try and attract them to feeders and things like that. So I think there's a lot of potential to incorporate color, but I haven't personally done anything. Is that something that you've seen being used in practice, or?
Well, typically your feeders are going to be red or green.
Right.
Anything that is put in pole boxes to draw birds to feed is typically green. So that coincides. So one other question, is something more attractive to a bird if it's stationary in the house or if it moves?
That's a good question.
I'm thinking of hanging stuff.
Yes.
Versus a bale of straw or something.
So another thing that I've been wondering too, in terms of these big barns that we have, the birds probably tend to develop kind of their areas where they like to hang out. And so it might be that we want to move things. So I think it was Dr. Daigle that was talking about the brushes. So in terms of litter quality and management, it might make sense to move things. And that could be part of changing the environment to keep those birds occupied. So moving it is not, I don't think, a bad idea. I don't know that we have any data on the science side to either support or not moving things. So hanging things, I think, yeah, that would be beneficial. I think doing anything rather than, not doing something would be helpful if it's the right type of thing that you're using. So that's kind of where the idea for the robots came into, because they move. I mean, in terms of enrichment, it's not something the birds want to interact with. So it's not really an enrichment per se, as opposed to a way to get them up and moving. So it's more getting at that movement activity level aspect. But you could attach things. So you could attach different kinds of colored lights to those robots. And that could be something that stimulates the birds more, right? If you have green lights and red lights and they're shining on different parts of the environment, they might get up and go peck over there. So that could be something else. I know there's people that have looked at laser lights. I think you had somebody last year, Shauna, that was talking about lights for broilers. Yeah.
I've had similar comments about robots and, whether that's an enrichment or not. So maybe call it a stimulator, or
Yes.
I don't know about enrichment, but I know that this was a leg health specific talk. I know you do a ton of work with turkeys, so I'm using this chance to ask you other questions. But maybe somewhat related. I know that pecking stones have been used for aggression, to maybe thwart aggression, and it might also be an enrichment. But I guess my question is threefold, sort of. Is aggression really as big of an issue as I think it is in turkey flocks? And is there an enrichment that could potentially improve activity, but not aggression, or are they not exactly related?
Yeah, so in terms of the level of aggression, we do see it in turkey tom flocks. So in all the years that I've been doing research with turkeys, I've had some flocks where I walk in one day and there's a bird that's been pecked on the head and it's dead, and it happened overnight. Could be there was something wrong with that bird and the other birds were targeting it. I don't know. So head pecking definitely is an issue. We didn't have a lot of it in this flock, so I don't know necessarily in terms of commercial scale. I'm trying to remember recent publications, and I can't put a number right now in terms of the level of aggression. So it can be an issue. There is some flock variability there, especially in terms of breeder birds. So that's a whole other ball game. So turkey breeder toms, those are pretty aggressive, and they will act aggressively toward the people in the barn as well. So that can be a big issue. The peck stones, that's an interesting one. I don't know how much they're being used in practice. One of the issues is, how do you give it to the birds? Do you hang it? And if you have stuff moving up and down in the barn where you're putting shavings out or whatever, is that going to be in the way? Can you pull it up? Or do you put it on the litter like we did? But then if there's any moisture, or, if it gets soiled, then you have issues with that potentially. So the peck stones, it seemed to help, at least with, they did use them. Those peck stones did disappear over time when we had to replace them. So I don't know in terms of the aggression, I don't know how much that would help. Maybe some. It would be interesting to look at that again, because we didn't have a lot of aggression. It's kind of hard to say. But yeah, there needs to be more work, because I know these peck stones are commercially available. You can put all kinds of, in theory, you can come up with all kinds of different combinations of things that you can put in there. So, yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.